Okay, so everybody, we are going to pick up where we left off. The last thing we started talking about before we had to end class was we were talking about Ming in China, and we were talking about Christian outreach, missionary work that came with some of that early attempts to trade. Um, there were a couple people I wanted to chat with you specifically about. These two guys right here. Have we covered this yet? I think we talked about opening the ports of Canton and Macau, or would you talk about this last? Peanuts right here. All right, cool. And then we talked about woodblock printing, how it advanced from the original printing press. Okay, good. All right. So, um, anytime we have trade, especially by the Christian Europeans, we see missionary outreach. Okay. We saw Las Casas go with Columbus on his very first voyage. Anytime you have European crown sending emissaries or trade explorers, whatever, they usually take some sort of element of the Christian faith with them. Both of these guys, Matteo Ricci and Adam Shaw, um, they played a fairly large role in an attempt, and I do say attempt, into trying to infuse China and spread specifically Catholicism to China. Um, So, a couple of things that the Ming do before we get into the Christian aspect of the European influence. Um, One of the things that the Ming do is they sponsor those overseas expeditions. Who was given the task of commanding them? Zhang He. Zhang He. A very famous, actually, a eunuch. He was spent. He actually went on 6 voyages, maybe 7 voyages, um, and actually created early Chinese connections with as far west as the east coast of Africa. And he and traded all and created like connections all in between the east coast of Africa and India, the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, um, and all of the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. The Chinese probably missed an opportunity. Unfortunately, when Emperor Yongle died, which we've already talked about, the Ming ceased funding those international expeditions and focus on internal improvements. They also basically rededicated those funds that were taken from the expeditions and refortified the Great Wall. Why? I'm glad you asked that question. Because of the fact that they were the ones, the Ming were really the first people to drive out the Mongols out of China. And there was an underlying concern that the nomads from the north might attempt again to come back into China to the south. The Great Wall is what separated them. Okay, so um, these two gentlemen here, Matteo Ricci is this gentleman right here, and this is Adam Shaw. We'll talk about Matteo real quickly. Matteo Ricci was an interesting individual. He was one of the first Jesuits to establish the missionary system or the missionary goal or endeavor to try to bring Catholicism to China. And he had a little bit of success. It was not widely popular, but he did have a little bit of success. Um, One of the other things that he ends up doing, he actually creates a map of the world in 1602. 1602, a map of the world is pretty interesting. He spends almost his entire life in China, trying to establish this idea of creating at least a pocket of Catholicism in China. What is China in terms of their schools of thought or religion? Jesse? Okay, Taoism is one of them. Annika? Good. Confucianism. We're also going to get into some Neo-Confucianism, which is like a revamped Confucianism, and Buddhism. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, Matteo Ricci, if you couldn't tell from the last name, Italia. He's Italian. Adam Shaw is actually from Cologne in Germany. Yeah. No, they were not working in tandem. Adam Shaw came a bit later. Mateo laid the groundwork. Shaw just happened to be part of Mateo's original efforts, like he was one of the people that went. And the reason that Adam Shaw is important is because he's really the first to adopt Chinese dress, Chinese clothing, although you can kind of see Ricci here is kind of decked out in some Chinese garb as well. Adam Shaw is actually able to work himself all the way up, all the way up the ladder, and he actually becomes an advisor to one of the Ming emperors, Shungxi. Okay, so it's almost Mongol-esque in the way that like Kublai Khan would pull in advisors from all around the world, like how we talked about Marco Polo was part of all of that. Adam Shaw actually served a very similar function. Um, Also, the adopting of dress, the adopting or the modification of Christian gospel is referred to as enculturation. It's an attempt made by missionaries. This is kind of like a good little tidbit for evidence beyond the documents, if for some reason you have to write about China. Enculturation. It's up here on the slide. Enculturation is basically just taking the Christian gospels and blending them. In this case, it would have been with the pre-existing Buddhist and Confucian faiths. Not necessarily rewriting them, but it's a syncretic attempt to try to blend the two or more than one religion with one or more other religions. One of the problems we see is as Catholicism begins to grow slightly, um, when these converts, these Chinese Catholics, pass on, there arises this big controversy in China as to are they entitled to the ancestral rights outlined in Confucianism because they've adopted Catholicism. Okay. And ancestral rights would be titling to what? Land, in particular, land. Okay. Okay. And that becomes a point of contention. And eventually, China will start to push back on Christianity and Christian missions, Christian missionaries. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on these guys? Anybody need more time? Okay. So here are Zhang Hei's expeditions. We've already looked at these maps, but you can see how extensive his travels were. And again, I've talked to you guys before about a missed opportunity, most likely by the Chinese, because these voyages took place in the very early part of the 1400s. Guys, Portugal doesn't send its first international trip down the coast of Africa until the mid 1400s. Okay. Had China made it a priority to establish international trade, they would have dominated the Indian Ocean well before the Portuguese could have ever set up, and then when the Portuguese got defeated by the Dutch. Okay. All right, moving on. Here is another picture of Adam Shaw. You can see these are two European missionaries that have adopted Buddhist dress in an attempt to demonstrate a willingness to understand and to accept as an avenue to try to spread Catholicism. Okay. So, Ming decline. Why do we see the Ming decline? Well, because like every other empire that we've talked about, what's that? They do get fairly large, and you can see here, um, this is the extent of the Ming dynasty. And keep in mind, the Ming actually come out of a version of the Song dynasty that was pre-Mongol. Remember we talked about the Southern Song? The Southern Song, very good. And they were located right in here. Here's Guangzhou, right next to Taiwan. The Southern Song was really kind of an area that survived the Mongol occupation to a degree. And they were able to retain a lot of their Chinese traditions and etc. And that really becomes the central point of the Ming. Do you have a question, Jesse? Guangzhou is right here. Correct. Well, it depends on the map that you look at. Um, yeah, I see Guangzhou twice actually. This is different right here. This is Yangzhou. I don't really do very well. I think you can spell it or see the spelling. It is Qiong. Guangzhou is Guangzhou. That's, yeah, Guangzhou is right there. Okay, so anyway, ultimately, we see famine striking the empire predominantly because they rerouted all of their money to rebuild the Great Wall and to improve the canal systems. And due to poor leadership, unfortunately, it opens the door for the next ruling dynasty, which is actually another foreign invading power like the Mongols. And that group is going to come from up here. Manchuria. The people from Manchuria are referred to as, well, yes, Manchurians now, but they call them, the group was called the Manchu. The Manchu are going to invade from the north, and they're going to go around the Great Wall. So whoopsie on putting all that money into the Great Wall. And the Manchu will rename themselves once they take control in 1644, right around their mid-1600s. They are going to rename the dynasty the Qing, Qing, the Qing. We'll talk about the Qing a bit later. Jin, Qin, Jin, and then the Qing, Qing. Jinzhou Qin Han. No, wait, it's Qin. Yeah. And then the Qing are the more modern. The Qing are one of two foreign occupied dynasties. Well, if you don't count the Japanese, but that's World War I too. So you've got the Yuan dynasty under the Mongols, and then you have the Ming, which are all Chinese, and then you've got the Qing, Qing, and the Qing are the Manchu. Oh, that's going to be the Qing. Yeah, they last a couple hundred years. Yep. And then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we start to see nationalism really start to flourish in China, and that's going to create the Nationalist Party under Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek a little bit later, and then you have Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, and we'll talk about that later down the road. Okay, the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty is overthrown in 1644. Large in part by the Manchu invasion. And again, like I said, we'll talk about the Manchu invasion in upcoming chapters. Here is a artist rendering of the Zheng He fleet. Again, his flagship was over 400 feet long. Estimates have it at about 440 feet. A really massive, expensive expeditionary force. Some other things going on with China just in general compared to Europe. China had a massive population. Most of China made their living doing what? Kind of like Russia. Annika? Farming. Yeah, most of China was still very much agricultural. A lot of very poor people. Majority of the population would have been poor, living living out away from the cities. They don't stress international trade, especially oceanic trade, because they already had the what? Ocean. They get away from transoceanic trade after they cut funding for Zheng He. They've already got another trade route, which is what? Silk Road. Very good. Yeah, the Silk Road, which has been around for centuries. Yeah, I know. It's kind of like a trick question almost. And again, a lot of that funding for international trade was reallocated to defend against the nomadic invaders to the north, not just the Mongols, but they focused on the Mongols, which was a mistake because the Manchus sneak around to the east and avoid the Great Wall altogether. Europe, on the other hand, continued to thrive. Europe took full advantage of new naval technologies, new weaponry, and they exploited the hell out of the rest of the world. And once Europe gets its foothold in, that really sets the tone for the next several hundred years. Okay, it's going to lead us. Obviously, we talked about slavery and the impact in Africa and the New World, but we also have imperialist actions of the late 17 and 1800s, where nations like China are going to fall victim to Europe carving it up and saying, this is mine, this is mine. Africa, same way. They carve up Africa. Okay? All right. Questions, comments? Fantabulous. All right, let's talk about my favorite, feudal Japan. All right, Japan, because it's on an island, has a degree of insulation from Chinese influence. However, they're not immune to European interests. Okay, Europeans see Japan. Japan does not have a plethora of resources. It does have some precious metals that are mined out of its mountains. And there is some early attempts made by Europeans to establish trade, and there is limited, very limited success. But I want to talk about the feudal period that Japan enters about 400 years after Europe does. Okay, the feudal period of Japan begins in the 1500s. Okay, this is after Europe has already secured its foothold in the Indian Ocean and is trading throughout, Southeast Asia. Okay, this guy right here, he is known as the Great Unifier. His name is Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga. He assumes the position of daimyo. Now, here's the weird, messed up way that he does this. So when the father dies, he was from a very small clan called the Oda clan. Now in Japan, the first name usually indicates the family lineage, not the last name. So Oda Nobunaga is from the Oda clan. His father dies, and rightfully it's assumed that the eldest son would take control of the lands owned by the Nobunaga or the Oda clan. Oda was a drunk. Like, he was kind of this wild child, wild card, disrespectful, didn't follow real traditional values. He actually shows up at his father's funeral and, like, is highly disrespectful. Keep in mind, the Japanese people are highly ritualistic. They're very ceremonial. And to lose face means to dishonor yourself and your family. Like, this is a thing. It's part of the Bushido, which is the warrior's code. Long story short, he's able to rally a fairly small but very well trained force of samurai, along with some really strong political leaders. And we're going to talk about the succession of him. He's one of the first samurai to adopt firearms, and he uses firearms very willingly. There's a lot of resistance in the samurai class against firearms because, again, it's borderline dishonorable to use firearms in battle because it's not the status quo. It's not the way things have been done for forever. One of the things that Oda does not like that will come back to bite him in the butt is his hatred for the Buddhists. He detests the Buddhists. And there is Buddhism all throughout Japan, Zen Buddhists by this time. He feels that they're a drain on society. He views them almost like a plague. And he actively, even his early years as ruler, he actually actively goes out and executes Buddhists, men, women, children, has them executed, burns Buddhist temples to the ground. He's very, very violent towards the Buddhists. And unfortunately, he will be killed by rival forces in 1582. But he's called the Great Unifier because he begins the process of unification of Japan. It does not end, or it's not completed with him. In fact, it takes 2 more rulers before Japan is fully unified under the Tokugawa. Okay, Toyotomo Hideyoshi. He is one of the very skilled generals that is led, or that is underneath Oda during the early years. Hideyoshi, by the way, if you take a quick notice, yes, there is a lineage here. Toyota. A lot of these old samurai families, a lot of these old clans have lineage to Fortune 500 companies now because of this desamurization. It's called the bakufu. Basically, when the samurai are really no longer needed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they take their warrior ways and they shift to business, which is really kind of cool. Yes. I don't know. Did we? Sometimes it like leaks out when I start talking about Japan because I really do enjoy talking about Japan. But Oda, yes. I don't know about Hideyoshi. Yeah, Oda Nobunaga, yes, probably. But Hideyoshi is the next in line. So when Oda is killed, yeah, Hideyoshi takes over. And Hideyoshi, ironically, comes from a non-noble family. He is an exceptional general. Comes from a poor class, works his way up. Um, Once he becomes the ruling daimyo of this growing unified group of people, he sets his sight to Korea and invading the Korean peninsula. The problem is that in order to get to Korea, you need lots and lots of what? Boats. Okay, you need lots of boats, you need lots of soldiers, and it's highly expensive. So he starts this invasion plan of Korea. Ultimately, it's going to end in failure. And Korea, because they have the backing of, to a degree, some of the Chinese support, they're not able to successfully invade or capture Korea. And he not only fails once, he actually goes back a second time and fails again. He, no. That was Mongols. That was 1300s. Yeah. Okay. And the final unifier, the actual unifier of Japan, is Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a young man when Oda had appointed him as one of his generals. And he came up under Hideyoshi. In fact, he and Hideyoshi had a falling out, but they reconciled their differences and were able to come back. And Tokugawa Ieyasu accepted Hideyoshi's leadership, but Hideyoshi ends up dying shortly thereafter. So once Tokugawa Ieyasu is appointed shogun, and it goes like this: shogun, daimyo, samurai. Shogun, daimyo, samurai. Now, sometimes, depending on what period of time, you may have an emperor that sits above the shoguns. So shoguns are above the daimyo are above the samurai. Okay, the emperor is above all. That's kind of the power structure, but they don't always have an emperor. So during this feudal period, Tokugawa Ieyasu is finally able to unify most of the island of Honshu. Honshu is the main island where the capital city of Edo was. Today we don't call Edo Edo, we call it Tokyo. Yes, exactly. The city of the Tokugawa. Again, Tokugawa is the family name. And like I said, or maybe Jesse, you mentioned this, Tokugawa is going to control Japan in some fashion, either as emperor or as shogun for the next 250 years. It's not until 1861, about the time we're going through our civil war, that the Tokugawa will finally be kicked out of the throne by Emperor Meiji in the Meiji Restoration. Well, Meiji. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it had, in previous periods, it had been the capital previously as well. It kind of bounced between Edo and uh, Heian. Heian was an earlier period that you don't need to know. There goes Heian period and the Ashikaga, and then the Edo period. And the Edo period, it kind of the periods are marked by where the capital's at, but the Edo period is this feudal period. All right, questions. Fantabulous. Here is the island of Honshu right here. Okay, the largest and most populated island. These are just some of the expansions. This is Tokugawa or Oda. This is the Oda clan's original home territory. They were actually a very small clan compared to the rest, but because Oda was willing to do pretty much anything, like kind of fight dirty. He was able to expand, and once he started to expand, he gained a lot of support from people around him. So instead of, fight against him and worry about winning or losing, they just joined. Now, not everybody joined silently, but okay. So a few other things, and then we're done. We see traders to Japan as early as 1543. Like I said, Japan did not have industry per se. Excuse me. Um, ultimately, Oda is the first to adopt firearms. And again, they don't have a ton of resources, but like I said, they do have some precious metals and minerals mined from their mountains. In fact, there was a legendary swordsmith by the name of Masamune. Now, Masamune was in sword making in Japan was an actual martial art form, like karate or kenpo or taekwondo. These were all martial arts disciplines. Sword making was its own discipline, but there was this legendary, probably like the best sword maker of all of Japanese history, and his name was Hanjo. His name was Masamune. Anyway, he creates this sword called the Hanjo Masamune. And the Hanjo Masamune was like this legendary, almost like Excalibur and King Arthur. Okay, you guys are familiar with the Arthurian legend. Okay, so this sword, this Masamune sword, which was a real sword, was purported that it could actually cut through steel. Now, whether it could or not, I wasn't there. It could also, you could take the blade and you could bend it till it almost doubled on itself and let it go, and it would come right back and still function. Now, oftentimes, like the strength of a sword is measured not just in its ability to cut, but also its flexibility to be hit from like the non-strong side. Anyway, so that sword, along with a lot of other swords, at the end of World War II and Japan's defeat, were collected by army officers. And there's a very detailed story of all of these like incredibly rare. In fact, the Hanjo Masamune is considered to be one of Japan's national treasures, like the Declaration of Independence for the United States. So, at the end of World War II, all the officers, when they surrendered, many of them took samurai swords, katanas, into battle. A lot of them that were wealthy and came from noble families had these incredibly old, like highly expensive, highly decorative swords that they carried into battle because that was their family's sword that had been passed from generation to generation. The Hanjo Masamune, along with all these other very, very expensive, priceless swords, disappeared. There's a record of it being taken by like some army corporal, and then it just gone from history. Nobody ever hears about the Hanjo Masamune again. Yeah, and he actually had a disciple, and it's kind of like this yin and yang story, but he had a disciple, and it's almost like a Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader kind of thing. But his disciple allegedly creates like this sword that was soaked with innocent blood and tears and all this other stuff, and it's called the blood something sword. Anyway, that was also one of the swords that was lost in this magical disappearance. But if somebody has that sword, like it's priceless. Like it's probably worth hundreds of millions. It's like what? Kill Bill. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Masamune. 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 Mune. Masamune. All right, sorry. Tangent. I'm done. All right. So one of the things that Nobunaga does is he actually protects the Jesuits. Does anybody know why he might do this? And I'll give you a hint. It's the bullet point above. Annika. Yeah, he wants to make sure he keeps that supply chain of firearms coming in, and you keep the Europeans happy by entertaining their Christian missionaries. He was not a Christian, but you keep those guns flowing, and the guns helped him to be victorious because a lot of his enemies did not accept firearms yet. Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was less tolerant. Hideyoshi actually came from a Buddhist family. And Hideyoshi was less tolerant of the Christians and a little less oppressive towards the Buddhists. Okay. This is another picture of Emperor Hideyoshi. Not really that important. After the 1580s, Japan decides to isolate itself. And in fact, the religion of Christianity under Tokugawa Ieyasu actually becomes a target. So if you want to watch, if you're at all fascinated by this, there's a really good Netflix series. It's kind of bloody, it's kind of gory, it's mature audiences, but it's called The Age of Samurai: Battle for Japan. It's a 4-part miniseries. It's actually really good. There's another movie. Does anybody here like Liam Neeson, Andrew Garfield, Adam Driver? Okay, if you enjoy those actors, there's another movie called Silence, and it's about the early missions sent to Japan in the early 1600s, right before Tokugawa Ieyasu makes Christianity illegal. And it is a very gory movie because it shows the slaughter of Christians, Japanese Christians, by Japanese soldiers. Okay, it's an attempt by Tokugawa to erase or eradicate Christianity from the island of Japan. And the only people that are allowed to trade with the Japanese are the Dutch and the Chinese. That's it. The Dutch, because they were there first and they were the ones that were bringing in those wonderful firearms, there was a tradition of allowing the Dutch to trade. The Chinese were also allowed to trade, but both of these countries were very limited. In fact, they could only deposit their goods on one island inside the Nagasaki harbor. Okay, and that was Deshima Island. And it was an island. They were not actually allowed to set foot on Japanese soil. They could step on the island, but they couldn't like take a little rowboat across to the mainland. If they did, they would be executed on the spot. Japan was not joking around. It's not until the late 1800s, post-US Civil War, that we see Japan reaching back out to the West to start to improve their military technology. Okay, this is post-Tokugawa rule, so like 1861 and after. And they do westernize under Commodore Matthew Perry. Have you heard of Matthew Perry? Okay, a famous U.S. Navy commander. He is one of the ones that goes to Japan and establishes trade relations. And they kind of force Japan to accept Western help because it's very profitable for the West. But we're going to regret that because about 40 years later, we end up fighting Japan in World War II. Good job, USA. Okay. And so by the time we get to 1650, Japan is almost completely isolated. If it doesn't come from Japan, they don't want it. And they become highly resistant to pretty much any kind of foreign influence. Okay, so this shows early Portuguese contact in Japan. Again, very limited trade and exposure. The last thing I want to talk about, I think it's one of the last things I want to talk about, is the reform under Tokugawa. So, Tokugawa Ieyasu is a nationalist. He is a firm believer in maintaining Japanese tradition and Japanese history. He wants no foreign influence. So what he does is he goes about creating a reform movement, not just, limiting trade and all these other things we talked about, but he also creates the Kokugaku. Kokugaku. It's kind of fun to say. It'll wake your mouth up in the morning. And basically we see a revisitation or a revitalization of Neo-Confucianism. Okay. Which again is ironic because it comes from China. But we also see a national school of learning, which eventually kind of is the more permanent form of the Kokugaku. The Kokugaku is the idea of removing scholarships and removing funding from any kind of non-Japanese study. Like they wanted to take any kind of foreign influence and make it nothing but Japanese history, Japanese tradition, Japanese religion, Japanese. Make everything Japanese. It's a highly nationalistic movement. Okay. And again, it just kind of firms up that idea that Japan doesn't need help from anybody else. Until, of course, they try to industrialize. Then they need help from other people. And they need natural resources. Okay, guys, I think that is about it. A Turkish caffeinette. Okay. Okay. Okay, this is the original Shinto god here, Bishamonten. Anyway, that's it. Who's got questions for me? Everybody feeling okay? All right, so for those of you at home, the test is going to be released here maybe within the next 5 to 10 minutes. I would like the test done for all of you guys by the time I see you next. So Monday night, 11:59. Is that enough time? 55 questions plus 1 written. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So Monday night, 11:59 will be the due date for the test. Please bring questions if you have them, or you can email me if you want. But other than that, I will see you guys next week when we hop into chapter 24.